Somewhere in the sands of northern Morocco, in the summer heat of 1578, a battle ended with three kings dead in a single afternoon. That alone should be one of the strangest days in European history. But here's the part that actually broke Portugal for the next 400 years. One of those three kings never had a body, no confirmed corpse, no funeral witnessed by the men who loved him. Just a young monarch who rode into the desert with an army of 25,000 men and simply didn't come back the way he was supposed to. Portugal spent the next 400 years waiting for him to walk out of that desert. People believed he would return on a foggy morning, on a white horse, to save the nation from rain. Grown men risked execution pretending to be him. A whole underground religion was built entirely around the idea that their king wasn't actually dead, just missing, just delayed, just biding his time. This is the story of Sebastian I, King of Portugal, the monarch who became more powerful as a myth than he ever was as a man. Walk with me as I take you on another journey through the eyes of history. Sebastian's story is dark before he's even old enough to understand it. His father died before he was born. His mother left for Spain not long after, handing him to his grandfather, who also died within the year. By age 3, Sebastian was king of Portugal with no living parent in the country and a regency running the show around him. But a lonely, motherless child sitting on a throne is exactly the kind of raw material that gets shaped into something dangerous. He was raised by Jesuit priests who filled his head with two things: God and glory. Not the boring kind of religious education, the kind that convinces a child he's been personally chosen for something enormous. Sebastian grew up believing he wasn't just a king. He was destined to be a Christian warrior hero, the kind who leads crusades and gets remembered in scripture level terms. Therefore, by the time he was old enough to actually rule, Sebastian wasn't interested in trade routes or taxes or the practical, unglamorous business of running a small European kingdom. He wanted a holy war. He wanted North Africa. He wanted to be the king who reconquered something for Christendom and made his name eternal. His advisors tried to talk him down. Spain tried to talk him down. Even the Pope, who you would think would be thrilled about a crusade, was lukewarm on the idea. But Sebastian was young, unmarried, obsessive, and completely convinced that God was personally backing his plan. The excuse arrived in the form of a deposed Moroccan sultan named Abu Abdullah, who had been kicked off his own throne by his uncle and came crawling to Sebastian for help getting it back. To most kings, this would have been a minor diplomatic favor. Maybe send some soldiers, collect a debt of loyalty, and move on. But to Sebastian, this was the invitation. This was his crusade, handed to him gift wrapped. He didn't send an expeditionary force. He mortgaged his kingdom for it. Sebastian drained the Portuguese treasury, borrowed heavily, stripped the country of experienced soldiers, and personally led an army of roughly 25,000 men, Portuguese nobility, foreign mercenaries, adventurers chasing glory, across the straits into Morocco. He was 24 years old. He had never commanded a real battle in his life, but therefore he marched inland anyway, deep into unfamiliar territory, deep into the kind of heat that kills soldiers before the enemy even shows up, toward a reigning Moroccan sultan named Abd al-Malik, who actually knew what he was doing. On August 4th, 1578, near a town called Qasr el-Kabi, the two armies collided, and this is where it earns its nickname, the Battle of the Three Kings, because by the end of the day, all three monarchs involved would be dead. Abd al-Malik, the reigning sultan, died of illness during the fighting, though his own side hid it to keep morale up. Abu Abdullah, the deposed Sultan Sebastian came to restore, drowned trying to flee across a river, and Sebastian, the golden boy of Portugal, convinced God had personally guaranteed his victory, watched his army get surrounded and torn apart in the desert heat. Portuguese chronicles describe chaos, heat exhaustion, and a battlefield collapsing in a slaughter. Somewhere in that chaos, Sebastian was last seen alive, still fighting, still refusing to retreat. But then, nothing. No confirmed sighting of his death, no verified body recovered by Portuguese hands. Just a battlefield full of the dead, and a king who had simply stopped being accounted for. Here's where the story turns from tragedy into something stranger. Days later, a body was presented to the Moroccan court, said to be Sebastian's. It was eventually returned to Portugal and buried with royal honors. Case closed, officially. Except almost nobody who actually knew Sebastian was allowed to properly examine that body before burial. The corpse had reportedly been stripped, mutilated, and left in the field for days in extreme heat before recovery. The kind of condition that makes positive identification incredibly difficult, even for people who wanted to get it right. Therefore, official Portugal declared him dead, but unofficial Portugal, the fishermen, the farmers, the grieving mothers whose son never made it back from the desert, didn't fully buy it. Because here's the thing about a king who disappears without a witness death. The human mind does not like unresolved endings. It fills the gap. And the story that fills Portugal's gap was this. Their king wasn't dead. He was ashamed of leading 25,000 of his countrymen to die in the sand for nothing. So ashamed that he fled somewhere, maybe on a secret pilgrimage of penance, and would return one day when he'd atoned enough to face his people again. But shame and grief were about to get real practical consequences. Sebastian died childless and unmarried. He'd been too obsessed with holy war to ever settle down and produce an heir. So the throne passed to his elderly great-uncle, Cardinal Henry, a literal cardinal of the Catholic Church, who was never supposed to be king and who died just 2 years later, also without an heir, because, obviously, he was a celibate priest. Therefore, Portugal was left with no royal bloodline to fall back on. And into that vacuum stepped Philip II of Spain, who had a plausible bloodline claim and, more importantly, an army to back it up. In 1580, Spain absorbed Portugal into what's called the Iberian Union. 60 years where an independent kingdom simply ceased to run its own affairs, folded into its bigger neighbor. For a proud nation that had spent centuries building an overseas empire, this was humiliating. And every ounce of that humiliation traced back to one battlefield, one king, one disappearance. Sebastian hadn't just died. In the eyes of his people, he had personally cost Portugal its independence. So naturally, grief, national humiliation, plus an unconfirmed death is the exact recipe for impostors to start crawling out of the woodwork. And they did. Not one, not two, 4 separate men, across roughly 2 decades, stepped forward across Europe claiming to be the returned King Sebastian. The first was a baker's son in Portugal, executed for the claim. The second was a hermit found in a cave, convincing enough that people genuinely debated it. The third, a Spanish conman, actually managed to gather real political support before being caught and imprisoned. But the fourth is the one people still argue about, a mysterious figure known as the pastry cook of Madrigal, whose real identity nobody ever fully nailed down, and whose case gathered enough believers that the Spanish crown treated him as a genuine political threat, not just a lunatic to be laughed off. Therefore, think about what that actually means. A king who'd been dead for 20 years was still dangerous enough, still believed in enough, that a full empire had to take the threat of his return seriously. That's not just grief anymore, that's a movement. And that movement got a name, Sebastianism. It stopped being a rumor and became something closer to folk religion. The belief that Sebastian wasn't dead, was hidden on a mystical island shrouded in fog, and would return on a misty morning to restore Portugal's glory and free it from foreign rule. Poets wrote about it. Priests preached coded versions of it. Peasants told their children about it, the way other cultures tell stories of returning saviors. But here's the darkly beautiful twist. Sebastianism didn't die when hope logically should have run out. When Portugal actually regained independence from Spain in 1640, decades after Sebastian vanished, people didn't say, well, I guess we didn't need him after all. Some said the exact opposite, that his spirit, his myth, had finally delivered what the man himself never could. The legend outlived every rational reason it should have faded. It got folded into Brazilian religious movements centuries later. It got referenced by poets well into the 20th century. A king who led his country into a catastrophic defeat became, over 400 years, a symbol of hope itself. So, did Sebastian actually die on that battlefield in 1578? Almost certainly yes. Historians overwhelmingly agree the body, however damaged, was genuinely his. But the truth of what happened to his body was never really the point. What Portugal needed wasn't a corpse. It was an explanation for how a golden, chosen, destiny-driven young king could lead his entire country into ruin over one afternoon of arrogance. And it's easier to believe a king is hiding, ashamed, waiting for the right moment, than to believe he was simply wrong, simply reckless, and simply gone. 400 years later, people still call that unresolved national wound Sebastianism, and it might be the most human response to grief that history has ever produced. Rather than accept the ending, an entire nation just rewrote it. Thank you guys for watching. Do well to like, comment, share, subscribe, and walk with me again through the eyes of history.